Good morning. This is Dr. Rutledge, and I'm happy to be here to talk to you about a revolution in the understanding of diabetes and has implications for the management and treatment of diabetes. So we'll be talking about saturated fat and, of course, blood sugar and the other parts of this. But first, let me go ahead and share my screen. All right. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. So I always talk about the mini gastric bypass, but most of this morning will not be about the mini gastric bypass. We're going to talk about diabetes. And the reason is that the mini gastric bypass can help treat and sometimes reverse diabetes. But first, we have to understand what causes it. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit this morning. All right, understanding the power and benefits of MGB2. First, we have to understand this new research I've been talking about, the cause of diabetes. And you may think you know that, but there really have been some remarkable changes here. So we're going to try and understand the power of the MGB2, which is the Billroth2 and the gastric plication. Now, we know diabetes is a deadly killer. It's the new cause of diabetes, that is, changing from sugar to saturated fat, we're talking about this morning. A brief overview. Diabetes, of course, is a chronic disease characterized by high blood sugar levels. And there's a type 1 and type 2. And type 2 is kind of brought on by the environment. So the traditional view was the environment we're talking about is sugar. Excessive sugar intake was long believed to be the primary cause of diabetes. And sugar consumption led to insulin resistance and beta cell overwork and ultimately beta cell collapse and severe hyperglycemia, and that damages the various organ systems and often leads to tragedies, including death. So that's the old interpretation. So type 2 diabetes was attributed to insulin resistance, the glucose intake and obesity, and the beta cells in the pancreas were believed to work overtime. So that's the old idea. And remember, beta cells produce the insulin. That's the hormone that regulates blood sugar. And beta cell dysfunction or failure leads to diabetes, the hyperglycemia. But recent studies have changed that. What we're talking about today is saturated fat. Saturated fat, the deadly fat that's found mostly in meat, dairy, and eggs. And what we're saying is that the pandemic of 10,000 diabetics in the United States and 10,000 diabetics in India is related to saturated fat intake. And not a little bit, but a lot, because the saturated fat intake now, we believe, is the cause of the beta cell dysfunction. Sugar is not good, but saturated fat may be critical in damaging those important cells in our body. And so the new term that's been brought up here is lipotoxicity. That means the fat kills. And it refers to the harmful effects of saturated fatty acids. And we cannot emphasize enough, we're talking about a killer. Recent research suggests that saturated fat plays a direct role in the development of type 2 diabetes. Saturated fat damages the beta cells, and this damage leads to beta cell dysfunction, insulin deficiency, and ultimately to patient demise, often preceded by terrible complications such as blindness, amputation, kidney failure, heart attack, stroke, and death. So saturated fat increases inflammation in the pancreas, contributes to beta cell damage, and impairs beta cells' response to glucose. You have glucose resistance. It promotes also the formation of toxic substances that have been found to damage beta cells, and it leads to the development of insulin resistance. Saturated fat plus sugar is a synergistic effect. So sugar is not innocent, but damaging the beta cell health. Studies show that saturated fat intake is a risk of type 2 diabetes. That is, reducing saturated fat improves blood sugar and controls individuals' type 2 diabetes better. Eat better, and you will improve the diabetes. And what we want to talk about later is if you cannot do that, we have a solution. That's the MGB2. So here's in vitro studies that's in the test tube, isolated beta cells. They take studies and they expose the beta cells to saturated fatty acids and it induces cell death. Okay, cell death, that is the beta cells, which are critical, the only place we get insulin in the body, and it kills them. Okay, oftentimes the patient would follow. Okay, a study in the Journal of Biological Chemistry found that palmitate, a fatty acid that's present in a lot of junk food, is a common saturated fat, led to changes and damage in the cells and death of the pancreatic beta cells. Also, high-fat diets. In rodent models, high-fat diets rich in saturated fats have been shown to increase beta cell dysfunction and insulin resistance. Study in Nature in 2002 found that mice fed a high-fat diet developed insulin resistance and beta cell loss. That is, fat kills your pancreas. Fat kills your pancreas. Stop eating so much fat. Human studies show basically the same thing. Epidemiological studies, large-scale epidemiological studies have consistently linked higher saturated fat intake in those members with an increased risk of type 2 diabetes. So the Nurses' Health Study, a long and a superb study, found a positive association. More saturated fat, more type 2 diabetes. Now, we also know that we can reverse it. That is, studies show randomized controlled trials that examine the effects of reducing saturated fat intake on beta cell function, that blood sugar control improved in diabetics with type 2 diabetes. There's a meta-analysis published in The Lancet in 2018. Dietary interventions focused on reducing saturated fat intake were associated with improvements in glycemic control. Another study, saturated fatty acids induced endoplasmic reticulum, part of the cell wall, the cells in the body, leading to beta cell dysfunction and death. Inflammation, saturated fat contributes to inflammation. The implications are massive. Rethinking the role of diet in type 2 diabetes. A greater emphasis on reducing saturated fat intake is critical to save your life and prevent diabetes in the first place. Reducing saturated fat is, in fact, crucial. We need to think long and hard about this, and saturated fat plays the most deadly significant role. Overall, diet quality is crucial. Nutrient-dense, healthy foods and a diet rich in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and notice I did not say McDonald's or pizza. Lean proteins help mitigate the negative effects of saturated fat. Reduce the intake of saturated fat, reduce the intake of saturated fat, increase other fats like olive oil, nuts, and seeds, and choose very lean protein sources, and emphasize whole grains, fruits, and vegetables. Plant-based diets may be critical. Here's our future directions. The available scientific evidence now strongly supports the link between saturated fat intake and pancreatic beta cell damage. That's diabetes and diabetes complications and death. Reducing saturated fat consumption is an important public health strategy for preventing and managing type 2 diabetes. Diabetes etiology has evolved from a focus on sugar to a recognition of the role of saturated fat. Reducing saturated fat intake, along with other healthy lifestyle habits, is crucial for preventing and managing diabetes. Now, let me say just a closing word here. That's all good, and I recommend you do that heartily and as fast as you can. But there's also the other patients who are already far along, already seriously ill, and that's where the MGB2 comes in. I hope you'll stick around to hear more about our life-saving and diabetes-crushing new operation, the MGB2. Thanks for listening.